Alrighty, hi everyone. It's that time of the week again. More comic book talk, news, reviews, and all that stuff. In the spirit of constantly striving for better videos and content, I have purchased a remarkably cheap tripod to hook my iPhone into to see if I can get a more stable video. And I'm now mirroring it off the computer to my right. So apologies if my head goes over there to check the screen every once in a while, but. I think this is getting a little bit better. At least there's no, there should be a little more stability and less kind of weird wonkiness in it. So hopefully this looks nice, and we'll get right down into it this week. We're going to be doing an omnibus review of a DC book, which I think is my first DC omnibus review. And today we're going to be talking about Grant Morrison's Animal Man omnibus, right? Something that has a lot of popularity and a lot of notoriety within the comic book community, specifically within a comic book community that I'm involved with, which is another YouTuber's Facebook group, Riley, who does the Omnibus Collector. People in that group talk about this book a lot, mostly because Riley has mentioned it being his favorite omnibus or favorite run, I guess, on a character ever. So I'm going to go over it today, give you my thoughts on it, sort of Grant Morrison and his early work. This is some of his earlier stuff. Not as early as his indie, independent UK stuff, but definitely earlier than what he's come to be known for. So today we're going to plug right through this and get some thoughts and opinions on this. It's pretty interesting. It is a DC omnibus, has the Animal Man spine on there. This book collects 26 issues, I believe, 26 issues, as well as a Secret Origins, like, sort of short story, all related to Animal Man and all written by Grant Morrison with art from a few different people. The book itself is pretty nice. It's actually sort of the reverse of Marvel Omnis in the sense that the dust jacket is like a matte finish, and then the inside is actually like a gloss finish, which I don't care for, personally. I tend to read my books without the dust jacket on, just to stop them from being damaged. And this kind of style of glossy boards, glossy, like, I just don't care for it that much. It doesn't feel as good to me in the hand. I really like the matte finish on the dust jacket. And, DC sort of goes for almost more of like a pop art kind of feel on a lot of their omnibus. I don't like the fact that they're not unified in any respect. Like, if you look at the Marvel Omnis behind me, they all sort of have that same Marvel Omnibus banner on them. And as somebody who is, really likes having shelves and arranging stuff, and, like, when I look at the Criterion Blu-rays I have over there, and they all have the same label and the same, like, a numbering system, I sort of like that, personally. I don't really like the shelf to be kind of all kinds of wacky different ones, and, this spine is nice, and it's minimalist in its own kind of respect, but it doesn't line up well against any other DC Omni or any other DC collection. So, their stuff is a little more character specific and a little less like DC specific, sort of. It doesn't have like an overall company theme to a lot of their output. The book itself is pretty thick for 26 issues. It's of a nice size, and the paper stock is pretty nice. The binding on DC's Omnis is not amazing. It's not so bad on this one, though. Like, it holds itself open pretty well. It's a little tight, and the back is a little rigid. So, like, from the beginning, it might snap shut a little bit more than a Marvel book might, but once you get a little bit into it, it's not bad at all. Actually, I was expecting much worse based on how people talk about DC's binding a lot. But I think it's pretty good overall. It's, it does its job. There's not so much in the way of back matter and extras really at all. There's a little cover gallery of stuff from Brian Boland, who does all of the covers for the books for the individual issues, as well as the cover for this particular book. So there's a little bit in the way of that, but in terms of extra content or making this worthwhile for somebody who already owns the issues, it's not really that worth it. I mean, it presents it in a nice oversized format, and it's all collected together, but the book is nothing to write home about in terms of an actual presentation or collection itself. So what is actually in this book, and who is Animal Man? To sort of start this book off, what you really have to understand and talk about a little bit is Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is it was a 1985 DC crossover event, and this book is born very, very much directly out of that. I don't think you need to have read Crisis to understand what this is and what Grant Morrison is trying to do here, but you have to understand that it happened. I mean, that you need to know that it existed. So basically, Crisis on Infinite Earths was DC's, it was like an event or a company-wide crossover, sort of a maxi series. I think it was 12 issues, where basically Marv Wolfman and George Perez got together as creators and made this story where all of the different continuities that were getting so confusing and convoluted within the DC universe were all thrown together in like this crisis, obviously, as the name states, and as a result of it, you come out with one timeline. This is nothing new, and I think there's been like 4 crises now. There's a Crisis on Infinite Earths, Final Crisis, Infinite Crises, Crisis on Infinite. It's a lot. There's a lot, and it's been rebooted, and that doesn't really matter. What matters is that this book is coming out at a time when the continuity was simplified. And this book, more than any other book I've ever read, actually deals directly with continuity, and with the sort of understanding of how continuity works for the characters that live inside these worlds. So coming off the heels of all of the DC universe getting smashed and rewritten, we have this book, which I believe started in 1988, somewhere around there. 1988, September 1988. So a few years after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and DC has brought in a number of UK hotshot writers, including Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and Neil Gaiman, probably are the 3 trio that I always talk about on here, and are most recognized as sort of the DC powerhouse trio that came in the late 80s and really shook stuff up. And so this particular work was Grant Morrison's first large work for American comics. And it focuses on Animal Man, which is sort of an obscure character that Grant Morrison resurrects from the dregs of the DC universe. And Animal Man is Buddy Baker. I think Baker's his last name. I know Buddy's his first name. And he is such a cool character because he's like the most blue-collar superhero that there's ever been. Half of this book is dealing with his family's protection from superheroes, and there's this whole scene where his people break into his house and his wife sasses them. His wife is awesome and his kids are awesome. They're it's a very, very, very typical sort of 80s suburbia kind of family drama woven through this superhero sort of conundrum. It's hard to call it an epic. It's more of a twisted tale of weirdness and continuity changes. But it's both blue collar on one end, and then totally esoteric and very in its own headspace on the other end. So it really runs the gamut of being appealing to a family story, as well as a drug tripping, craze balls, amazing multi-universe spanning story. It's all covered in here. And part of that problem, I think, actually, of spanning that amount of content is that this book feels a little scatterbrained. And Morrison talks about it in here, and it's actually because what this book becomes over its 26 issues is not exactly what he envisioned it. The first 4 issues in here are basically its own miniseries. It was sort of launched originally as a 4-issue miniseries just to kind of bring Animal Man back and showcase this kind of vegetarian animal rights fighting superhero, which is something that Morrison is personally involved with. And so the 4 issues there sort of have a very different tonal feel than what it becomes later in the story. These 4 issues sort of deal with animal testing and zoo animals and kind of the heart of African animals needing to break them out of the zoo, and that is its own story, which does pop up again, but it is very much sort of self-contained. And then after that, there's a series of maybe 5 or 6 issues that all feel like they're sort of separate, weird tie-ins. This was going on at a time where there was like a Hawkman's people were invading Earth, and so there's a few crossovers. I'm personally not that familiar with it, but I know that was what was going on in the DC universe. But what really sets the stage here is issue number 5, which is called The Coyote Gospel. And Morrison won a lot of praise for this particular issue, and it really became the foundation for what this book eventually turned into. And in the Coyote Gospel, it's a really, really, really interesting story about this cartoon character, sort of this Wile E. Coyote-esque character, and how his suffering and his death and this sort of repeated cyclical, foretold role that he plays out is actually what's binding the universe together. It's really fascinating, and it brings in this concept that Morrison has of kind of the world that these characters live in as being unfolded from a dimension above it. It's something that he talks about a few times in here, and it's sort of something along the lines of that humans have talked about too in philosophy and stuff like that, as in there's some greater creator, whether it be God or whatever entity, and the earth and the reality that we understand is like an unfolding from an upper plane that is sort of being written into existence. So, literally in if you look at this comic book, there is, like in the Coyote Gospel, there's an artist, sort of like a Walt Disney artist, sort of, and he is writing into existence the lives of these different characters. And the coyote has to make a sacrifice to him and to sort of be in this particular martyr role to make sure that everybody in the different dimensions that it crosses between stay safe. It's hard to explain. You should definitely check that issue out, even if you're not interested in the rest of this. The Coyote Gospel is just a single issue that you should probably read because it has a lot of the heady materials that Morrison gets into later in this, but it's really digestible. And basically what Morrison says about it is he got so much, he received so much, praise and really admiration for it that he started to say, well, maybe that's the direction I want to take this entire series in. So after you have these kind of series of not one-shots, but kind of random stories and these little, like, morality tales and stuff, then you start to get into the meat of this book, which is really issues about 10 through 26, where you really get into some very, very strange territory, especially for comics. There's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff in here. There's like a really, really extended drug trip scene that's really interesting, where Buddy and this other character go into the desert and basically take peyote and go through this entire tripping scene to come to grasp with the nature of reality. And I don't want to spoil a lot of what's going on in here, but basically this book, as I said before, deals the most directly with continuity, more than any other thing that I've ever seen. And what I mean by that is, sure, you could say Crisis on Infinite Earths deals with continuity, right? It is a story about continuity, but its characters still they're not self-aware. They are still going through this story, and this is happening to them, and then it's done, and that's it. But in this, Morrison kind of says, well, so let's say there was a Buddy Baker, there was an Animal Man before 1985, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and now I have my Animal Man. There must be some tension in this sort of creative space in the way that these two can coexist with each other. Or do they coexist? Or is one replacing the other one's lives? And that's really what gets at the heart of this book, is Animal Man and Buddy become a more central point in sort of grounding and tying together the realities. Because what Morrison proposes basically is that after Crisis on Infinite Earths, everything is in shambles. There are characters that some people remember that are still exist in their memories, but they've been written out of the world. So these people are imagining the characters, these dead characters, back into the world, and it's kind of this whole, reality of the past versus reality of the present, and if there's different multiverses and they're all crushing together, that how do you kind of reconcile all the different identities that are all trying to compete, right? If there are 20 different Supermen, and there are 2 or 3 different animal men and all these different things like that, is one of them the real one, or are they all sort of these figments of somebody else's creative imagination? And it really gets into that. That's the meat of this. Morrison does a really good job of writing and orchestrating it. What's interesting is that this book, despite being, so whacked out in its themes, is written very, very simply. Most all of the book is done in only 6 panels per page. Almost every page of this book is 6 panels, 6 panels, 6 panels. And it makes it very easy to follow all of these sort of whacked out things that he's going, towards, and these different crazy ideas. Because, if you see, even on these crazy drug trips, it's actually basically just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's all split up into really easy to comprehend and very readable ways. So despite how, out there and ludicrous some of the ideas might seem on first, reading them, it's done in a way that is very, very readable. And I think that's what people like about Morrison, is that he kind of takes a lot of these ideas and makes them very, very grounded and understandable when you're actually reading them. 6 panels, 6 panels. It's all very, very simply laid out. And so the real question is, do I like this book? The answer is, I think it is good, and I enjoyed it, but I do not think it is great or amazing, and I will tell you why. Because it suffers from something that I don't know if there's a term for this, but it basically suffers from being self-aware, in the sense that, to me, it's not enough to point something out and say, look at what we did, because in doing that, you still had to go through the original trope. So to illustrate my point, I guess I'll talk about like a video game, for example. There's a game called Far Cry Blood Dragon, right? Where it is a very, very highly self-aware game. And in that game, you're playing a tutorial. And as you're playing the tutorial, the character is going like, oh, fuck this tutorial sucks. This sucks. I've done this before. And so it's supposed to give you this insight like, oh, the developers know, the writers know, hardy har, and you kind of chuckle at it. But the problem is you're still doing the tutorial, right? They haven't actually circumvented the tropes and the problems that they're making fun of, right? So there's different layers of reinventing and restructuring comic books or video games or movies or anything. There's one layer to say, look, we understand this. We see this is going on, and let's all laugh at it together. But at the same time, you're still presenting that thing, and you're making them go through it. And I think Animal Man sort of suffers from that as well, where, it is, I enjoyed a lot of it. It is very well done. I think the art style is very, fun and super 80s and throwback, and I liked, most of the characters and everything. But when it gets to these points where it points out these inconsistencies or these things, and it says, look at what happened, look at what we did, and then you're supposed to realize it and go, oh, with him, those points still happened. I don't know if this is making sense, but I feel like there's ways to sort of circumvent those, which Grant Morrison did, later in his works. It's hard to criticize something that's your first major, 26-issue run. It's quite an achievement, especially the ending of this. The last 2 or 3 issues get really, really interesting, where there's a direct contact between Buddy and the source, the creative source of the book that he's in. So it really, he's like, I'm in a comic book, and then he starts to understand what these things are that are happening to his life and where these empty places go in his memory and all that stuff. But the point is that if you point out, I'm in a comic book and this is why all these things happened, those things still happened. You haven't circumvented them and really delivered a totally new or transformative experience, like maybe The Invisibles or one of the more sort of esoterically interesting Grant Morrison works. In this, it's still a little clunky, and all of the tropes and all of the sort of the villains and the silliness that it brings along with it, which Morrison celebrates in here. He's not saying that that's bad. It is celebrated and sort of thought of as like this really great, and fun ride to go on. But when you're pointing out what you've done, having still made the audience go through those things, I think it rings a little bit hollow, instead of sort of figuring out a way to present these ideas and work around the traditional structure of it. I hope that made sense. In my mind, it does. You know, it's sort of like if you're showing somebody a movie, it's almost like the Not Another Teen Movies or something like that, right? If you're parodying something, if you're showing somebody a movie and you're saying, look at these things, we understand these jokes, you understand these jokes, but you're making them still absorb these crappy jokes, it's not really moving anything, or it's not really transforming the medium in a way that a lot of people might say this does. So I think this is like a good surface level of that. It sort of understands itself, and it was one of the first books to say, like, look at this medium, look at what we're doing, you know, how can we break this medium? But I don't think it successfully transcends it in the way that I expected it to, based on how much love it's gotten. I hope that made sense. In my mind, it does. You know, it's sort of like if you're showing somebody a movie, it's almost like the Not Another Teen Movies or something like that, right? If you're parodying something, if you're showing somebody a movie and you're saying, look at these things, we understand these jokes, you understand these jokes, but you're making them still absorb these crappy jokes, it's not really moving anything, or it's not really transforming the medium in a way that a lot of people might say this does. So I think this is like a good surface level of that. It sort of understands itself, and it was one of the first books to say, like, look at this medium, look at what we're doing, you know, how can we break this medium? But I don't think it successfully transcends it in the way that I expected it to, based on how much love it's gotten. I would still highly, highly recommend reading it. I think it's certainly a fun ride, and I really enjoyed Buddy and his whole family, especially. I think his wife and his kids have some really cool moments in here, and I wish that more superhero books sort of brought that aspect in, you know, where there's sort of the family life or the home life or the downtime in between being an Avenger or in the Justice League or whatever is explored a little more. I think it does an excellent job of that. And I think the price is totally right on this thing. The cover is, I believe, $75 is what they're asking for, but you could easily find this online for $35 to $40, I would assume. Somewhere around $40 would be right. So, you know, if you can get $40 for a really thick, sort of mind-expanding comic book like this, I think you should absolutely go for it. Don't expect it to, you know, really totally rewrite how you understand comics, but if you're somebody who has never given thought to the structure of comics or the way that characters work inside of them, this is going to give you an interesting insight into, you know, the way comics are structured. It's not going to explode your brain if you're somebody who has read and has thought about and has dissected comics as a medium for many, many years, but it still is a really enjoyable read. All right, guys, well, I hope you at least found this review to be somewhat insightful in what I was trying to explain. You know, sometimes it's difficult to talk about the super esoteric or kind of more genre bending or breaking or form or medium bending comics without spoiling so much and without just making it sound like a bunch of gibberish jabberish. So hopefully this meant a little bit something to you and at least gave you an idea about whether you would enjoy Animal Man or not. I'm planning on soon tackling a question that was brought up in the comments last week on my last video about why do I talk about these three authors, mainly, you know, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, and Grant Morrison. Why do I talk about them so much, and why does everything need to be compared to them? Does everything need to be compared to them? So the next video I'm going to do is more of a conversation piece, sort of really getting into that, you know, having reviewed another a Grant Morrison book today, you know, another piece of literature by one of these three guys. I think it's time to talk about what they mean to me and what they mean to comics, in my opinion. So look for that soon. That should be coming out later this week or next week. I really hope you enjoy the content on this channel. I am constantly trying to improve and change around stuff in terms of how it's recorded and presented and given to you guys. So please bear with me if it looks a little weird or if there's, you know, positioning stuff for the first little while. It's going to take me a little bit to get this looking a little nicer. So as always, you know, subscribe if you enjoyed these. Please give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Is Animal Man one of your favorite series, or have you ever read something that really explores the medium of comics in a way that Grant Morrison does here? And please follow me on Tumblr at the Nerdventurer. .tumblr.com, I believe is how you get to it. It's a really fun, more art focused blog, as some of my other videos have mentioned. Just posting a bunch of cool stuff and showing some hauls that I get every once in a while. So yeah, look forward to more content next week. I'll try to push this out to you guys soon, and I will talk to you then. See you in the comments. Thank you.